Why do you always
I'm a
forget
little
this
frustrated by
app?
Sam Harris's current issue with Ezra Klein.
Oh my God, it's been so exciting. It's just been like,
it's
been awkward, really, more than anything.
It's been awkward.
Like, people are like
he
talking about it on my Facebook feed and stuff, and I'm like, oh, we're excited about something.
You're just there with the heart emoji.
So, did you listen to the conversation he had with?
I listened to
what
the
was
original.
your takeaway?
Well, maybe just to summarize for listeners who do not know this, Sam Harris had a guest on his podcast named Charles Murray, who wrote a controversial book in the 90s about intelligence
and race.
Well, apparently there was a chapter on race in the book.
Is this one of the co-authors of the Bell Curve?
The Bell Curve.
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Yeah. So he had him on the podcast about a year ago, and it was an okay podcast, and I think Harris pushed him on thing like, so there's kind of two slants to this. There's the scientific evidence, like in the statistical analysis of actual data, and then there's Murray's opinions on what public policy should come out of that data. Yeah. And I'd say that, so Harris had him on because he basically doesn't believe that any scientific data should not be able to be talked about. It didn't necessarily, I mean, he made it clear in the podcast he didn't necessarily agree with all his policy.
Right. Well, he tried very hard to make it clear that he didn't agree with the policy.
Yeah, and he pushed him quite hard, on, like, especially on the issue of like, why study this? Like, well, like, okay, you can try to find IQ differences between different races, but why study this? And he pushed him quite hard on this, and he didn't really give a good answer, and it is what it is. So fast forward to a year later now. Apparently, Harris made a snide. Sorry. So after that podcast came out, Vox published an article on criticizing the podcast. So, and then apparently Harris made like a snide comment about to Ezra Klein on Twitter, and it kind of reignited everything. And, I'm kind of asleep to all this, right? And then I get an email because I actually do really like the podcast. So I get emails from samharris.org all the time. And it's like, I'm so mad. I'm publishing my email exchange with Ezra Klein. Here it is. And honestly, I didn't get through it all because it's boring. But,
how could you not read it all? At least half of that would be Sam Harris.
I
right?
know.
If he
right?
read it, it'd be different.
But it doesn't have his
he
voice.
Didn't read it.
Anyways, so eventually, long and short, they have a podcast that was released this week. And, how did I find it? It was interesting. It was really interesting to me because it kind of comes back to this whole. So I think most people listened to it and thought that Ezra Klein sounds reasonable, and especially if you're leftist, very like heartfelt in his concern for fairness for people of different races and how they're perceived and how they've been treated, blah blah blah. And I think Harris just comes out as surly and argumentative, and it's really funny to me but for me listening to it, I found Klein just so annoying because I can tell he's very Tverskyyan, okay, in his approach to. This is not a jab at Gleb Tversky, but it's an homage to him or whatever. You can tell that Ezra Klein is not neurotypical. However, has had a lot of media training on how to speak, and so no matter how much Harris called him unethical or arguing in bad faith, he never he was always very genial. But there was one point in particular in the podcast where he. Well, actually, no, he got a little bit angry once. He was like, like something like, I've let you speak. Now it's my turn to let you let me speak or something like that. But he also said something. He said, you do blah, blah, blah. He's like, oh, I'm sorry. I should be using I statements, and I'm like, he's been totally trained. This is all bullshit. That's like, he's like Hillary Clinton level of like awkward. Cause you can tell he's not being genuine, but he's just trying to do it in a way that'll appeal to the neurotypicals.
It's the background, right? Like, Sam Harris, he does podcasts, but he's not, a media person. Ezra Klein is a journalist.
Well, Sam Harris is well known for being able to give very biting and funny, like debating him. He can very much like play to the crowd, and he can kind of like land these zingers. But yeah, he's not good at this. Like, if somebody kind of, this is what this podcast did for me, is it shows me that Sam Harris is shit. If somebody mirrors back that politician level of refusing to get upset and just being very genial at everything. Like, so I don't actually agree. I think they were mostly talking past each other,
Yes.
and Klein just didn't. I can agree that he isn't that he isn't acting in good faith, because Klein is not stupid, and Harris would say things, and he just wouldn't talk about the thing that he would derail the subject.
They both did that. That's the trouble.
Well, see, from my perspective, I wanted to hear Klein's answer of all these charts, because I think what you have to listen to is the Extreme Housekeeping edition first. Okay, so Harris says this hilarious thing at the beginning of every episode where he's like, "Okay, before we have our interview, I have some few housekeeping notes. Well, I'm going to be having a speaking.
I've actually signed up. I got the podcast. I listened when it's interesting.
So he has listen to the Extreme Housekeeping edition, because that's where he kind of has like a 40-minute rant on what happened and what his opinion of what happened is, and then there's the thing with Klein. And yeah, it's just they are talking past each other, but the thing is, Harris does acknowledge many points in the podcast, like, yeah, I agree with the things you're saying, but you're not addressing the thing that I'm saying that there's no scientific data that should be taboo to talk about, and you're saying how important it is that Black people are given equal rights in this country. And he's like, we're not talking about this again. But he said that several times. And I was very frustrated with that Harris sucks at dealing with a guy like Klein. It
was an interesting conversation in that sense, but I got a different impression. I got the impression that one of them was talking about here's data, and the other one was saying, yeah, but here's data in the societal context. And they're both going, well, but look at my perspective. Well, no, but look at my perspective.
I just don't understand. I guess for me, what is Klein saying? Like, you can't look at certain scientific data if it's in a certain societal context.
He's saying that you have to recognize the impact that it's having, especially when you have somebody like Charles Murray on your podcast.
But if you listen to the podcast with Charles Murray, it's quite like they really do take pains, to really.
Well,
they
more so during the
interview,
interview, but the initial. And actually,
in the podcast, the original podcast
Harris is flat out wrong about the fact that this is scientific consensus. There's so much debate going back and forth right now that there is no
I don't know if you're right about that, because consensus. I don't know if you're right about. I don't personally know. I'm not in that field, but I do know that several prominent people in the field have come to the have defended the scientific portion, anyways, of Murray's work. I mean,
that's the thing too.
Editor of a major journal on intelligence and other op-eds in the New York Times from other prominent scientists.
Says this is the scientific consensus, and just nobody wants to talk about it. But
who says that, sir?
Well, Harris said that.
Yeah. And
then there's actually scientists who researched this field who disagreed with that statement. The Vox article.
But apparently the Vox people are not. Those are the people that are not.
That's
what I'm told.
Rejecting them.
I don't know. I don't think so, because there's a series of other articles that don't reference that. The editor of Intelligence, which is a journal on the neuroscience of intelligence, so a real journal, the editor in chief of it, defended Harris and Murray's conversation, saying this really is the consensus. And there was another article in New York Times. Sorry, I can give you the articles for the show notes, but there was another one recently in New York Times that also defended the science. Now, what policy should come out of that is a totally different kettle of fish.
Absolutely, and I think that's where the conversation was missing. And I do think that there is something to be said about there is still a scientific debate going on whether or not racial IQ levels are a relevant thing to discuss, because there's context that determines those things as well.
Social scientists would tell you IQ is bullshit.
Yeah.
For the most part. That's what we think. So
yeah, there's factors to the relevance. It's kind of like going to the shitty part of town and the good part of town and noting who has better cars.
So I guess the argument that neuroscientists would make is that if what is the metric that they use for IQ? It's called, they call it not Q. There's a letter for it. Is it Q? Or anyways, there's whatever metric they use for that correlates with all sorts of positive, like you are more likely to make more money and have a better job and have more happiness in your life and blah blah. It correlates with all sorts of things. So that's what they would argue, that it implies that there is a strong.
But that's a societal measure of value, though, right? That's not. Intelligence isn't necessarily dictated by success, right? Those two things aren't correlated, if that makes sense. It's not. how do I say that?
Yeah, but that's what they think the data shows.
I think that the IQ may or may not play a role in outcome, but there's also other inputs, right?
Yeah.
There's other factors that play roles in that.
I'm not an expert in this field at
So-
all. I wouldn't.
I'm not an expert either, but I did study this a bit in university. The big thing, the biggest thing is the culturally dependent factors of IQ. It's way too culturally dependent to be an accurate measure of intelligence. Maybe if everybody was born in the same monotonous culture with the same language, with the same regional variant or same regional identity, or like if everything was the same across the board, maybe then it could be an accurate measure. But I think there's just too many confounding variables, culturally speaking.
I think that's part of the conversation that was missing between Klein and Harris. Is this discussion of, or even Murray and Harris was necessarily this discussion of multiple factors that influence outcomes rather than just this IQ.
So my understanding, and I've not looked into this in journals, or so my understanding is that scientists have actually, I don't know how, but they think that they have isolated these cultural influences, whatever. Like, well, apparently, I don't know exactly, but I'm told that they think they might that the consensus is that's what they were actually arguing. That's what Harris and Murray and editor of Intelligence were arguing, is that these aren't that it's not a thing. Now, I don't know. I really don't know. I don't shoot the messenger.
No.
That's what they were saying.
I'm of the opinion that
that's not my field.
I'm of the opinion that they are simply wrong about that, because even the test itself has often been recognized as being culturally and.
I've heard that argument before, but I'm telling you that they said that argument is wrong. Straight.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know if it's wrong or not, but I'm telling you that's what they said.
Physical sciences people probably would say that, though.
I think that's the issue. Klein did mention things like that when he was talking to Harris. Was that
it's kind of a weird discussion, really, because two non-experts in the field arguing about the data. It's very hard. I think.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't listened to the podcast, but it's two non-experts fighting over something they kind of know about, and yet it's their egos not letting each other.
Right.
It wasn't.
Yeah, it very much was more about the egos of the people involved than the actual
To me, it was interesting from just that level of being like, of how all his media training, I mean, Ezra Klein handled Harris and made him look really bad.
Yeah, that's true.
You know what would be interesting?
I thought that was interesting.
We could bring a social scientist on and have them, this is an interesting question. I'm curious about it, about the actual data. I know I've seen data before, but I'm not, that's not what I do every day. I'm not an expert at that, so.
That wouldn't hurt.
I find it interesting too that I didn't listen to the podcast myself. I was more listening to the opinions of people that had listened to the podcast, and the people that previously supported Klein's position and previously supported Harris's position continued to support their respective positions.
Minds weren't changed?
Minds weren't changed. It was kind of like the ham nye debate all over again.
I was reading some of Harris's fans on Facebook, and it seemed to me like some of them had been pushed away from Harris. Like, some people were reinforced, but it did seem like some people were expressing, I'm going to have to think about whether I watch this or listen to this podcast anymore.
Is that right?
Yeah, I definitely saw a few comments like that. I don't know how widespread it is, but yeah, Klein really didn't make him look good. Or Harris did not come out good on that. Which is not to say that I disagree with what he said, and I was personally swayed, but I thought it was really interesting that Klein sort of owned him in this sort of context right. where making snide smart, because that's what Harris does, right? He's really good at making biting criticisms, and if somebody will engage with him on that level, he can really make them look bad. But if you pull a Hillary Clinton on him, you could make Harris look really bad.
Well, and the thing is, when he sparred with Ben Affleck on
it's very Affleckian. It was so Affleckian. It was exactly the same.
But it was the same thing, though, because Harris seemed so unflappable.
Well,
on
he wasn't upset. Like Harris wasn't upset in this podcast. He wasn't upset. It's just that he didn't.
But he did get riled up and he admitted it that he was pissed off.
In previous, not on the podcast, I wouldn't say, but like that they recorded together. He definitely admitted he got angry before. But it was like that same sort of like both. Ben Affleck and Ezra Klein have that same sort of moral righteousness on their side when they argue with him that, like a naive listening or watching of it just kind of makes you side with them just because like they're...
I didn't side with Ben Affleck though. I did not side with Ben Affleck. I sided with Sam Harris.
Can you see where Affleck was coming from though? He was just trying to...
Actually, now I can.
I don't know.
He was just trying to protect the, against bigotry and blah, blah, blah. You could see where his liberal moralism was coming. And he was just trying to be a good person. I think both of them are.
Something I find interesting is the idea that Sam Harris isn't righteously indignant. Like he imagines himself as immune to bias.
Yes.
As though he himself has...
He never says that. He says specifically that he...
say that.
He's transcended bias.
He did say that. He said that...
No, he denied that certain things
He's not affected by this bias that is affecting Ezra Klein.
I know I've heard him say that that he has bias before. I know I've heard him say that, but
he very much...
Anyway.
And he did use that same kind of idea, like you're righteous about your cause, and I'm just defending the poor Charles Murray who was villainized by people on the left. Except it's the same. It's the other side of the coin, right? Like they are both the same. On the same coin, they are the same.
It was interesting. Another podcast. It's maybe even better than this one to listen to if you really want to hear what happens when Sam Harris has this kind of conversation. It's like number 32 or something like that. It's like he titled it the best podcast ever, sarcastically.
Miriam Namazi.
No, it's with Omar Aziz.
Okay,
he's a Canadian. Very left leaning, and he wrote a kind of a scathing article about him. I think in Salon. Okay. Anyways, it is an awkward as hell conversation. Some people, you either love it or you hate it. I loved it. I relished in it. I was just, like, it's so awkward, and I'm just like, I don't know. But you can totally see how and you can see how they both think they're right, and it's just fascinating. Yeah. It's fascinating. I don't agree with everything Sam Harris says. I like it, whatever.
And that's a good way to think about separating the person from the idea.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Because
I know a lot of people really, really don't like Sam Harris. And a lot of it is because they view him, not specifically because of Charles Murray, but because that feeds their narrative about him as this right-leaning type person who supports race realism.